Even intelligent, savvy people sometimes get tricked by Russian propaganda. But not all Russian propaganda is targeted at smart, sophisticated readers. In fact, some of it is so unbelievably dumb, you'd have to be some type of idiot to fall for it. Why then is the US president repeating some of the most childish Russian talking points? And why is his negotiator continuing to behave like he's finally figured out what the Russians are really after? Is there any truth to any of it? I'm Paul, US Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is a story that is absolutely bananas. I don't know what else to tell you. And I just want you to listen to this clip with me of the United States president. This is the president of the United States, right? Just headphones on and listen to this.
He served out his offer to purchase more Patriot missile batteries.
Oh, I don't know. He's always looking to purchase.
The question, by the way, the audio is a little badly mixed here. The reporter asked, is Zelensky has asked to purchase more Patriot missile batteries. Are you going to do so?
Missiles, you know, he's against. Listen, when you start a war, you got to know that you can win the war, right? You don't start a war against somebody that's 20 times your size and then hope that people give you some missiles. And by the way, I took my cognitive exam as part of my physical exam, and I got the highest mark. And one of the doctors said, "Sir, I've never seen anybody get that kind of. That was the highest mark." I hope you're happy with that. Although they haven't been bugging me too much to take a cognitive, but I did do my physical and it was released. I hope you're all happy with it. I notice there's no question, so probably you are. But the cognitive, they said to me, "Sir, would you like to take a cognitive test?" I said, "Did Biden take one?" "No." "Did anybody take one?" "No, not too many people took them." I said, what about Obama? Did he take one?" "No, he didn't take one either." I said, let me be the only one to take one.
Okay, so this is absolutely fucking insane. The reason it's insane is because, one, I gotta just say this real quick. The cognitive test he's describing is not a cognitive test. It is a dementia screen. If you can't pass it, you have dementia. It's actually, I think, one of the diagnostics. It includes tasks like draw a clock or identify an animal or repeat words that I told you earlier. It's not a cognitive test. And the reason, of course, likely Joe Biden probably did take one and probably failed it. And then Obama didn't take one because you don't get screened for dementia in your 40s. That's how it works. Just like when I go to the doctor, they don't screen me for dementia. Right? They screen me for the things that a man in his late 30s gets, FYI. So again, but that's literally the least dumb thing that he says. That's it. The fact is that you notice he said, Zelensky, why would you start a war with someone 20 times your size? And if you've been viewing this channel, you may know that the detail he misses is that Vladimir Putin's Russia invaded Ukraine, a neighboring sovereign state. That's Russian forces entered Ukraine. Now, the Russian propaganda spin machine would say that Ukraine was dared Russia to do it. Why? Because they were going to join NATO. Now, I want to point out the fact that Trump has said, well, NATO's off the table for Ukraine. And in fact, in 2014 to 2022, Ukraine was not a NATO member. They were not on any kind of timetable for NATO membership. In fact, because they didn't have control over all of their territory, because Russia had annexed some of its territory already, Ukraine could not become a NATO member, right? Because their admission into NATO would have triggered an Article 5 event. And so NATO called them things like a valued partner or a future member, right? But again, you know, my daughter has a patch that says, future park ranger. It isn't the same thing as her being a park ranger. She's 18 months old. And so future NATO member isn't the same thing as being a NATO member. And that's something that Vladimir Putin knew. And right, because Trump has said, Ukraine's never going to be a NATO member, we, the United States, are going to veto it, yet he persists in the war. So clearly the war objective is something else, right, other than NATO membership. And I want to point out the fundamental reality of the international system, guys. The following line right? This line here, that is the boundary of the Russian Federation, is where Vladimir Putin stops being able to tell people what to do, right? He could not tell Estonia, you better not join NATO or else. Estonia's its own country and became a NATO member. He can't tell Latvia, you better not join NATO or else, right? Because Latvia is its own country, right? And so Ukraine has the right to do whatever it wants. If Russia thinks it should run Ukraine, right, then it should look at where its borders are. And that's why Vladimir Putin is changing the borders, okay? Right? You notice, can you show me on the map where Ukraine is engaged in war with Russia? Oh, look. It exists here, a tiny fraction of a fraction of a fraction, a few dozen acres, not even a mile, a few dozen acres of Russian territories held in a small counteroffensive. In contrast, right, all of this land in red is land that has been annexed by Russia illegally from Ukraine and has taken place over the course of a decade. So Ukraine didn't start the war in 2014. Ukraine didn't start the war in 2022. And the fact that the leader of the free world, again, even if you believe that the U.S. should be more of a peacemaker and less of a partisan, right? It should not support one side over the other. Should say, well, we want them to get together and sort it out, which is deeply flawed intrinsically, because without their biggest supporter, the power imbalance shifts dramatically against Ukraine and in favor of Russia. But even if you somehow ignore that reality, if you somehow put your head in the sand through that, that doesn't mean that the president has to repeat Russian talking points. In fact, as the Ukrainians have made clear, they will not deal with someone who they don't think is credible. And so if you are unable to simply say these things, right? You notice that Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, they're actual politicians. They're actually somewhat informed from their actual analysis, not from social media brain rot. And the reason they say things like, diplomacy is how this conflict is going to end, right? But you notice that statement doesn't assign blame. It doesn't sit there and whitewash away Putin's crimes, right? It simply says, hey, why don't we try talking about it? Which is dramatically different from reality is not what you say it is. And this kind of disconnect from reality, and the fact that he says this insane shit, I think he looked around the room, my theory, and was like, oh shit, everyone's looking at me like I'm a fucking idiot. And then he has to tell people, no. I took a cognitive test. Again, it wasn't an IQ test. It was a dementia screen. It's a mocha. I took a test and it said that I've never seen a score that high. Again, guys, you do not get an IQ test as part of a routine exam. If you are over, I think about 65, you take a mocha test. And there isn't I'm trying to think of how to put this nicely. There isn't a high score. You just do the things, right? You go from 1A to 2B to 3C to 4D to 5E. Congratulations. Repeat this copy of the bed. Draw a clock of 5 past 10. Right? Name these animals. Okay? This is the cognitive test. Right? Read the words. Subject must repeat them. Do 2 trials. Even if the first trial is successful, do a recall after 5 minutes. Right? Digits, repeat them in order. You could see the total possible score, 30 points, okay? And the fact that he dropped this after making a frighteningly unsophisticated gaffe, to me says that this is someone who is aware that they did not do so well, right? We've seen this trend, right, where Trump has a tendency to sort of roll out literally cope like in real time. So he talked about people panicking when the markets began to fall after his tariffs were announced instead of rise like he somehow thought they would. He talked about the Fed desperately needing to cut interest rates when Treasury yields spiked, right? You see him sort of talk about his greatest insecurity. And so I actually think that, again, he said this stuff. Everybody around him was like, and he could probably even see in like Marco Rubio and JD Vance's faces where they're like, hey man, you're saying something fucking crazy. Then he goes, but I took a cognitive test. The cognitive test said I was great. It was the greatest score they've ever seen. That's also something you tell somebody who, has dementia. I'd be curious, his official health report didn't actually include his MoCA score. Right? Which is interesting. But don't worry, Trump isn't the only aging idiot, right? Steve Witkoff, who, by the way, is a sprightly 61, practically a fucking Olympic athlete compared to President Trump, right? Again, also 60, probably is getting a MoCA test. Has now been able to identify the 5 territories that are the key to proposed Russia-Ukraine deal. Now, again, this is something that Witkoff, God bless him. He continues to get completely trolled by Putin, continuing to have these meetings. The Russian president expressed a desire for a permanent peace, right? That's, of course, achieved through victory. And he says it took us a while to get to that point. So, again, what's worth noting is that this is part of the Russian strategy we talked about yesterday, or 2 days ago, where the Russians commit an egregious war crime. They bomb the center of a downtown city for absolutely no reason, kill a bunch of civilians. Europe condemns it as a war crime. The Ukrainians are even more furious with the Russians. And then Vladimir Putin, now that he's helped polarize the Ukrainians against him, is now suddenly Mr. Peace. And his goal is exactly what he's managed to achieve, which is to manipulate the White House into thinking that he's a serious peace negotiator. Now, what's worth noting is that the peace deal is about these so-called 5 territories, right? What he's referring to is, of course, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. And this is this is not what the peace deal is about. Vladimir Putin's own statements have said, yes, we want to annex these regions, conquer these regions. Let's use real words here for things. If your military is marching across territory by force, you're conquering the regions, right? Just like if the president was to use military force or coercion to take Greenland as U.S. territory, we would be conquering Greenland. And so Vladimir Putin is conquering these regions, but that is not the other issues, right? The other issues that Vladimir Putin has said he wants to see is what he calls denazification of Ukraine. But obviously, Ukraine is a democratic country with an independent constitution, and notably a Jewish president. So very difficult to sort of square that circle, but facts never get in the way of Russian propaganda. And the thing to remember is that you have so you ask yourself, well, how does Putin know if he's denazified Ukraine sufficiently? Well, the answer is, of course, any government that isn't, that he wants to have veto power over the government, right? And this is, if you want to see how the veto power is used by larger states to coerce smaller ones, look at Hong Kong, right? The Chinese have said, listen, we don't want to pick who gets elected. We just want veto power over candidates based on national security laws. We want to look at what they've said, for example, if they've ever made subversive statements or if they've ever made anti-China statements as measured by China. We just want the right to withdraw those candidates. And then from the slate that we choose, you Hong Kongers can elect whoever you want. Of course, now, right, here we are, 5 years later, 6 years later, and the Hong Kong, the only opposition party in Hong Kong, the Democratic Party, has voted to dissolve itself, right? Because all of their members are now in jail or forced into exile. And that, of course, is the end state of this. This is the power Vladimir Putin wants to have over the Ukrainian government. He wants to say, listen, Ukrainians can elect anyone they want as long as I get to approve the candidates first. And so in effect, what he wants to do is create a Belarus type of government, right? Belarus has elections. The only candidate they're allowed to vote for is Lukashenko. And Lukashenko, of course, is only in power because of his complete submission to Vladimir Putin. So that's what he wants to do for Ukraine. He wants the right to veto any candidates that come in as being too Nazi, right? And so that is the other core part of his larger objective, is to create a vassal state in Ukraine and create a 1900 style sphere of influence where countries, small countries, don't actually have independence. They are vassal states that can only take actions with the permission of their larger hegemon who dominates them. And in the case, again, of a country like Belarus, the Ukrainians look at Belarus and they say, "You are this. What an impoverished country whose economy has shrunk because literally the Russians extract resources from it." And they say, look in contrast to Baltic states like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. These are countries that have experienced over 2 decades a incredible rise in living standards because they made a Western pivot, right? They introduced free markets, representative government, collective security through NATO, and it's made a huge difference to their economies. And so again, Vladimir Putin wants to say, no, you can't make that choice. You are a vassal state. And remember, he also wants to be able to tell NATO that I get veto power over NATO. I decide when NATO lets in new members. I decide where NATO puts its troops. And that's what he's trying to negotiate here. Again, the insanity of believing that you finally figured out that this is fought over 5 territories is fucking stupid. And the fact that Witkoff thinks that he's found the core issue is just so unbelievably naive. The fact that he thinks that Vladimir Putin is engaging in sincere negotiations is naive. Now, before we talk about the likelihood or lack of likelihood of this actually ending, and more importantly, why Vladimir Putin seems to be talking out of both sides of his mouth, well, I wanted to mention that, of course, today is a Tuesday, which means we just dropped a new video on Combat Vet News, right? Combat Vet News is, of course, functions as my Patreon, right? You guys know Patreon itself, YouTube, they do not like war content, right? War is scary and uncomfortable. Yeah, that's a fact, Jack. And so I take all the uncensored combat footage and I do a deep dive analysis, including like today's footage that was video sent to me from guys on the front line that I met in Ukraine. They sent me video of a Cab 5 bomb, or a Cab 500 really, hitting near their position. It was crazy. If you want to see that analysis, the breakdown of what a Cab is, and of course, more GoPro footage of close combat, plus, you want access to the archive of hundreds of uncensored combat videos that let you trace the entirety of the war. But most importantly, this is how you support me, right? I don't have that many sponsors. I make politically controversial content. This is not the day and age to be critical of the White House, but we have to speak truth to power. We have to be armed with real information to assess things. And so if you want to support me in my quest to do that, you become a member. Help me out. Get the shout outs at the end of videos, especially the lieutenant and colonel tier members. You guys get access to the Q&As every Thursday. So check it out. The link is in the description. Okay. So here's what I want to point out. Polymarket. Polymarket, a great market here, a prediction market. You might note that it was one of the markets that we looked at going into the election that actually, even though most of the polling analysis said that there was a 50-50 chance between Trump and Kamala, the Polymarket polls actually showed almost on election or the day before the election, it was something like 2/3 Trump, 1/3 Kamala. So it was a really accurate and effective market. And you can see that one of the things that it's had is actually a Trump ends the Ukraine war in first 90 days. And you can see that early prior to the election, he actually November 7th, right? They thought there was a 53% chance that Trump would indeed execute on it, right? But by the time we got to his inauguration, there was only a 19% chance of it happening. You can see that slowly people have early optimism in these negotiations has slowly given way to the reality that Vladimir Putin and Russia have really no desire, right? At one point, very briefly, they thought there was only a 60% chance that he would fail. But now you can see that as Vladimir Putin has made more and more clear, as the level of naivete has been made more and more evident, and the fact that Trump is just not the negotiator he bills himself as, right? He's mostly good at negotiating on reality TV. He's not good at negotiating in real life because, fun fact, negotiating in real life is way harder and way less sexy than reality TV. And so you can see right here, March 17th, boom, everybody understands. Right, Steve Witkoff, probably a complete idiot. Right, I think this actually is Tucker Carlson interview where everybody says, "Oh my God, this guy is incredibly naive." And you can see what's happened. Everybody realizes this is not going to happen, and the odds steadily drop to zero because this event is going to close in just literally tomorrow. But you see, will there be a ceasefire before July? Slightly different question here, right? And you could see now those odds have plummeted to just 20%. You could see that will there be a ceasefire? Again, a ceasefire sometime in 2025. You can see those odds also just plummeting as people steadily come to the realization that Russia isn't actually interested in peace. They're interested in conquest. And the Ukrainians are committed to defending their country, essentially preserving their sovereignty at all costs. Because remember, the Russians 100 years ago genocided the Ukrainians in the Holodomor. So to the Ukrainians, there's a reason why Zelensky and the war remain popular and continued aggression against continued defense against Russian aggression remains the primary strategy. It's because, well, frankly, the Ukrainians think with decent evidence that they will be literally obliterated by a Russian occupied government, or they will be culturally annexed, culturally deleted from existence, right? The Ukrainian identity will be completely erased by a Russian dominated government. And so you can see again, this, even in the next 8 months, there's only just a 44% chance. And I want to point this out, right? Even Dmitry Peskov is saying, listen, there's not going to be, quote, lightning fast results. Well, yeah, of course not, because this is because Russia isn't serious, right? And while they say everything is moving well in regard to bilateral talks, what I want to point out, right? Russia is willing to engage in negotiations that, quote, take into account modern realities, i.e., we keep whatever we've conquered, and to eliminate the root causes, which is the Ukrainian government doing things that we don't want them to do, a non-Kremlin-dominated Ukrainian government, right? Now, of course, the root causes, he says, are NATO's violation of obligations not to expand eastward, which worth noting. If that were true, then you would not have NATO members like Finland who have joined. They would have been subject to Russian incursion. The Baltics would have been subject to Russian incursion. In fact, there had not been eastward expansion of NATO since 2004. The only countries that have entered NATO were like Balkan states, Montenegro. So again, prior to the Russian invasion, this is just something that was completely made up. This is total fiction. And again, Ukraine's discrimination against Russian-speaking minorities in Ukraine, also preposterous, right? And Russian pre-war demands, of course, that peace deal that Ukraine was offered in 2022 was tantamount to effectively a total capitulation, right? Now, the fact is that the Russian government, one of the reasons they're saying, hey, this is going to take a lot longer, is because they're winning, right? Remember, Vladimir Putin was willing to fight when the Europe and NATO were like this, when there was a veto-proof majority in the House and Senate that would pass continued Ukraine aid, when Ukraine had the full-throated support of the United States, and then Russian forces were being pushed out of Kherson, out of Kharkiv, out of, then when they lost the Battle of Kiev. Remember, when Russian forces were facing defeat after defeat, they were still persisting in their fight. And so why on earth would Vladimir Putin ever not continue to fight when Ukraine is at its weakest? It's been hit their primary backer now actively hates them, now repeats Russian propaganda that is almost childlike false. Again, that Ukraine invaded Russia, not the other way around. That, Zelensky is a dictator, not adhering to the Ukrainian constitution and subject to the approval of the Ruda, the Ukrainian state parliament. All of these things are patently false. Donald Trump keeps repeating them. And he said there's not going to be any aid. We're going to demand not just extraction, but we're actually going to demand massive we're going to want a colonial style setup where we extract resources from your country. And why would you stop fighting when your enemies are at their weakest? That is not the calculus of even any rational person. No rational person is going to make that calculus. If Vladimir Putin is going to extract as many concessions as he can, and right now his military, his economy is stable, it is persisting, and it's other countries in the globe, remember, are getting sanctioned because that's what a tariff is. It is a sanction on your allies. And so the United States has said, listen, we're sanctioning Western Europe, we're sanctioning Ukraine, we're sanctioning China, we're sanctioning everyone. We are not sanctioning Russia more. So now Russia is a little bit more even in terms of their economic prospects. You'd be an idiot. I would be an idiot. I would tell you, if Vladimir Putin called me and was like, what should I do? I mean, I'd tell him to fuck off and go home. But if I was stuck in Russia and he's like, you're my advisor or you're going to get thrown out a window, I'd be like, dude, keep fucking fighting. Keep raising troops, keep fielding old drunk soldiers, and keep the fight alive, dude. Keep pushing the Ukrainians back. They've never been weaker. And the fact that Trump believes that what he's doing is moving the ball towards peace is absolutely fucking insane. I am in awe of the poor negotiating that is happening. And Russia knows this is just a game, because you notice Russia is also turning around and says, oh, I'm interested in peace to the US, but then proceeds to threaten other NATO countries, right? He calls, this is a statement from TASS, the Russian state media outlet, that Poland and the Baltic states will be the first to suffer as a result of what they call possible NATO aggression by NATO. Guys, worth noting, NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO would not support the would not support an aggressive invasion of Russia, right? And Russia knows this because, again, the Poles and the Baltics should understand, this is a quote from the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, should understand that they so far do not understand that in the event of aggression from NATO against the Union state, the Russian Federation, the damage will certainly be inflicted on the entire NATO bloc, but to the greater extent, the first to suffer will be the bearers of such ideas among political circles of Poland and the Baltic countries. He said Poland and the Baltic republics are distinguished by high aggressiveness, at least in words. You see, now we've done the classic Russian propaganda move of mixing words. See, the aggression is actually by saying mean things about us, right? Which is not military aggression, guys. Military aggression is military aggression. Just like saying Ukraine started the war maybe by saying mean things about Russia, and so Russia invaded them, right? And so just like how an insane person, if you say, hey, put your dog on a leash, and then they shoot you, they'll go, well, technically, he started it because he asked me to put my dog on a leash. That obviously won't work in a court of law, and that's not going to work here because it literally defies common sense, right? And then they say in words, they are constantly rattling their weapons. They say Poland has gone so far, now listen to this, to announce its plan to install 2 million anti-tank mines along the borders with Belarus and Kaliningrad of the Russian Federation, and expects and hopes to receive American nuclear weapons as well. This second part is a fantasy. Poland has never said that. And frankly, Poland has a large enough economy, it could just build its own nuclear weapons. But more importantly, guys, how are the anti-tank mines in Polish sovereign territory an aggressive act? Think about it. They're mines on the Polish side of the border. In fact, they are actually constrained. Think about it. If you're Poland and you wanted to, let's say, invade Russia, which is what this guy's fantasy is, mining the border makes it harder because there are fewer areas where your invasion force can go. They're canalized because you've mined so much territory. But the mines also impact the ability of Russia to invade, which means that, again, the mines only are defensive tools. So if your fear was that Poland was going to invade, then you would be reassured to see them deploy large-scale mining operations. Because again, if Poland were really an invasion threat, why would the Russians not mine their own border, right? The fact that they're not likely says that their goal is to use their military to threaten and coerce Poland and the Baltics to submit to Russian threats and coercion. If Russia doesn't want you to have NATO troops, Putin's going to mass troops on the Polish border, say, we're going to Ukraine you if you don't withdraw NATO troops. And what choice does Poland have? Now, Poland, again, is like, we have a choice. We're going to build our own fucking military because our economy is as large as yours. And so I want to point this out because are these the statements? Are these the things you would say of a government who is interested in peace? Is this a peaceful, defensive people? Is this a government who is committed to the peace process and acting in good faith? Or is this someone who's talking out of both sides of their mouth to create as much confusion, as much to break up any kind of alliance as much as possible, right? The U.S. says, wow, Putin's a nice guy to us. This is a classic narcissist move, right? Where when people who might ally against the narcissist will sit there and say, oh, well, I'm going to treat party A like 10 out of 10 excellent, perfect friend, incredibly generous, and I'm going to treat party B just like shit. Just fucking pointlessly harass them, pointlessly ruin their lives. And what that does is prevents a potential alliance from ever existing. It's a classic narcissist psychopath playbook, right? You see a threat and you just sort of do everything you can to separate them. But the thing is, the narcissist doesn't actually like the person they're elevating, just like they don't actually hate the person they're denigrating. They only care about themselves and their own interest. And that's what Vladimir Putin has made abundantly clear. He's like, I have one interest, and it's myself. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Utson, Bastian Himling, Brian Kelly, Del McCombs, James Ola, Henry Roos here, all of our Lieutenant tier members. I couldn't do it without you guys. I appreciate you all so much, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.